I'll start by introducing myself in case you don't know. But my name is Shannon Blocker. I am the Pottawatomie County Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent. I've been in here in Pottawatomie County since 2017. And I've actually been an extension agent for K-State Research and Extension for a total of 18 and a half years at this point. So this has been my career, and I imagine it will continue to be so. While working for Extension, I did complete a master's degree in agronomy and specifically in soil fertility. So this is kind of my wheelhouse and something that I'm really interested in and want to help people understand and know more about. And for that reason, I decided that I would go ahead and host and be the presenter for this series of meetings. But ultimately, we have a wealth of resources at K-State Research and Extension, people in the soils lab, people in working with forages, people working with specializing in crops and rotations and all those things. So those things are all at your resources by reaching out to me. That's an easy way to accomplish those goals as well. So tonight we're doing the first of these 3 meetings, and we're going to be covering fertilizer basics. I do want to go ahead and just at least acknowledge that K-State is an affirmative action, equal opportunity employer and provider. And so you can see our "And Justice for All" poster that is at meeting sites and in our office. Whoop. Okay, so in the Fertilizer Basics presentation and in the flyer, I mentioned 5 key things that I wanted to cover this evening. The first of those is soil testing. And I actually am going to go moderately quickly through soil testing. If you have additional questions or things that you would like to know about soil testing, feel free to put it in the chat box, just shout it out, it'll be okay. But I want to kind of go quickly through that part because the other parts may be the portions where you may have less experience and knowledge about how that all works in the process. So we're going to talk about the importance of pH. We're going to talk about fertilizer recommendations and understanding them, and then the philosophy options that are available. So K-State has a couple of philosophy options, as well as most fertilizer dealers and soil test labs across the nation have kind of a philosophy on how they make their fertilizer recommendations. And then we'll talk about nutrient sources. So this is primarily the fertilizers that you can use, but does include things like manure and those things as well. Probably won't touch very much on manure tonight, but can at a later time, especially the 3rd session. And then calculating fertilizer blends is going to be how we're going to finish up this evening and try to cover all of this in a relatively short amount of time. My goal is to be about an hour, so I don't want you guys to sit for longer than that, and no one wants to listen to me talk more than that as well. So we'll go ahead and try to accomplish that in that timeline. I may go a little over. I have a tendency to get pretty excited about this content. Especially since it is something that I have done some advanced study on as well. All right. So soil testing. There's some equipment that I would recommend that you use in order to do that. And the first one of those is a soil probe. And the picture of a soil probe is here in the side of this, this photo. And this is just one example. There's lots of manufacturers, people who do a lot of soil testing, learn what style of soil probe they like the best. You'll need a clean plastic bucket, and I emphasize clean because especially in this county, a lot of us also have livestock that we take care for as well. And one of the stories that I've been told over the years is that a livestock producer used the feed bucket that they use to feed their cattle to put their soil samples in. And there was a little bit of residue left in that bucket. And so when they mixed up their soil samples and submitted them to the lab, their phosphorus levels, for example, were off the charts. And so that's something to think about. You want your bucket to be relatively clean and definitely not to have any livestock feed or things like that, fertilizer included, because they will throw off your soil test results. I recommend that you get some soil test bags. They're available at our office. And I also recommend that you write your name, at least the county, and sample ID. Those three things need to be marked clearly on every bag that you have, and then do that before you open it up and put the soil in it. The submission form and the grant form that applies for Pottawatomie County can be achieved at a later time, but all of these things, except for the bucket, can be borrowed or used from the Extension office. So how many soil samples do I need? And honestly, this is probably the one thing that, and the question about subsamples is the most misunderstood thing about soil testing in my experience. So let's pretend that this is your field in this picture right here. And I went ahead and I went to the Web Soil Survey online and found out that this field has basically 3 different types of soil, but they're not very big chunks of the small differences, as well as this field is not particularly large in the first place. And so maybe you want to think about how you're managing that. If you're managing this field where you're cutting off this top leg and growing a different crop in the top leg than in the bottom leg, well then yes, you should take 2 soil samples for that. If there was a dramatically different soil type in one site versus another, you may want to take more than 1 soil sample. And so really, it matters on how you manage it, as well as will you use results if you get different results to fertilize differently. For example, a lot of times, especially on the, I guess it would be the east side of a gravel road, the first 20 feet or so of a field will have high pH. And it's because the dust from the road gravel gets incorporated in the soil and raises that up. You wouldn't want to probably lime that area. So if you know that you want to treat that area differently, you can sample it separately, or you could just choose to not sample that area and know that the majority of the field is going to be different than that. And there's all sorts of different methods and things that you can do. But I'm just going to move on now at this point to the subsample part of it. We're going to pretend that I'm going to just collect 1 sample for this field. So when you do that, you need to take 6-inch soil cores, and I call those subsamples. And those cores are 6 inches deep and about 1 inch or so wide. And it can be done with a sharpshooter spade, but quite honestly, the soil test probe will make the process enormously easier. For all of our major nutrients that we would worry about in a soil test, the 6-inch soil test is the correct depth. If you're no-till and you only want to look at the lime requirement, possibly a 3-inch sample, but that requires a separate test to do that, I can adapt your 6-inch sample to more accurately reflect how much lime that you would need for a no-till situation though. And then mobile nutrients. And these are the big picture things, especially this nitrogen and sulfur. These 2 nutrients cannot be effectively measured with a 6-inch sample. In other words, the results that you get out do not equate to results that you would see from applying fertilizer in the field. And I'll go a little bit more into that later, but essentially, if you want to soil test for nitrogen or sulfur or chloride, you have to do a deep sample. And that means approximately 24 inches deep, or as deep as you possibly can go. And so most of the time we just do not soil test for these nutrients because of that deep sample, unless we're required to, or we really want to do some intensive management. When you submit one soil sample, it must include a minimum of 10 subsamples. And that's probably another area where people tend to underestimate or be a little bit short on the number of soil cores that they collected. It's very easy to walk up to a field, drive up to it, open the gate if there's a gate on it, grab some soil with your shovel and put it in a bag. But the results that you get from that kind of sampling basically are meaningless. In many ways, you would be better off just observing the crops and see if there was any deficiency symptoms that you would see in the crops themselves. So in reality, you really have to do that 10 as a minimum of subsamples, and 20 would greatly increase your accuracy and your repeatability, which what that means is if you went out and you sampled, soil sampled today, and then you created a sample and submitted it to the lab, and then you wanted to go out a week from today and resample, the accuracy of those samples, you haven't grown anything, you haven't done anything, maybe no fertilizer has been applied, but the accuracy of those samples goes up. In other words, they're going to be the same if you have more subsamples, or they're more likely to be similar. And then we recommend having a zigzag or a W pattern in order to cover the area being tested. So here's a little drawing that I made on the field that I'm talking about. So you don't have to make a drawing. There's no reason to do that unless you're trying to plan about how many samples you need where. So I took more samples up here in the top part of this field and then worked my way down the length of the field and took subsamples at each of the X's that are put in there. And you'll put that into your clean plastic bucket. Then you'll stir it together. Oh, and the reason I have this over here is that I like to use free things and things that I have available to myself. And so I have on my phone a Nike running app, and it was a free app. I did do some running, but do less running nowadays than I used to. But ultimately, this app is really useful for seeing where you traveled in your field. It puts out a chart of that area, as well as can track where you are and how long it took you to get there and that kind of stuff. So that piece of information can be another resource for you if you want to download apps to your phone. You can kind of see where you've been so that you know that you've covered your field more effectively. So you put those in the clean plastic bucket, stir them together. Again, it's about 6 inches deep, and you pour at least 2 cups of that mixed soil into your soil sample bag. I'm going to tell you the at least $20,000 secret that I learned when I was working on my master's degree. And that is, if you put WD-40 in the soil test tube, and even on the outside of the tube, you will not mess up your soil test results, but getting that soil out of the soil test probe is significantly easier. So WD-40 is the secret. We tried PAM and we tried vegetable oil and some other products, but WD-40 was the most effective lubricant that didn't mess up your soil test results. So if you have to do a lot of soil sampling, keep that in mind. So, all right. And then I just want to briefly show you the sample submission form that we do. I usually fill this out when you come into the office with your samples. We deliver them to the Throckmorton Hall in Manhattan. If you deliver them yourself, and you are allowed to do that, although we're happy to do it for you, you really want to be sure that my name is on the form. and that I'm Pot County and that you're Pot County. And the reason for that is when they bill us for those soil samples. And when they bill us for those soil samples, it costs less than it would be if you were to submit those samples just as a farmer or producer and not go through the local extension office. So basically this pricing that you see here is the pricing for K-State Research and Extension contacts. It goes up a little bit, not a lot, but enough that you don't need to pay them extra money if you do this without going through my office for the recommendations and those kinds of things. So how's everybody doing? Everybody good? Everybody knows how to soil sample, right?
Yep.
How many samples do we need?
10 to 20.
Yep, 10 to 20, very good, excellent. All right, technically you could do 100 or more and your accuracy would continue to go up, but who wants to do that much effort, right? No one. So, all right, so understanding your soil test report is the next thing that I kind of want to talk about and show you about. So, soil test results are the analytical data that the lab generates based on the different tests that they do. And so the top one that you see here is going to be an example of just the results from a soil sample that was submitted to K-State Research and Extension and our soil testing lab there. And so you can see that they will come up with a soil pH number, and the soil to water 1-to-1 is the kind of test that they use. You can see that they are now using Socorra as the buffer pH. It used to be SMP, but there is some noxious or dangerous byproducts from using SMP, and so they have kind of transitioned to Socorra fairly recently. Loss on ignition is how they do organic matter. Phosphorus is now Melic 3, which is pretty much a 1-to-1 ratio between Melic 3 and Bray 1, which is the other most common phosphorus test. K-State did do the Bray 1 for quite a few years, but has probably been Melic 3 for at least the last 10, maybe a little bit longer. Potassium and zinc, that they're kind of telling you that information, but this is the results. This is an example of results from like a grid sample that may have been submitted to a different lab, but they have the same key components. You can see here, there's an organic matter, there's a water pH, there's a buffer pH, there is a phosphorus, and they use Bray. There's another phosphorus, but we don't need to really worry about that one in this case. There's a potassium that they use. There's sulfur, zinc, all of those are there, but all the same key components in a result are the same no matter what lab you send it to. And quite honestly, if you did a good job of soil sampling, if you took your one soil sample, mixed it up really well, and broke it up into 3, 4, 6 different samples and submitted to every lab available to you, your results would be really close because results is the lab process. So there's no differences for the most part on any accredited lab in using their results. The differences come into the recommendations, and we're going to talk about that later. And also results, sometimes it's important to you to have certain tests, being able to turn those around in a quick manner. So all of those things impact which lab that you choose to use. Here's another example of results. Again, the same basic information is here. Here's an organic matter, here's a phosphorus, here's a potassium, here's other things. There's the soil pH, sulfur, zinc, all those things are still on these results from a different lab. For references for any of the things that I'm kind of working on today, the main one is going to be our publication called The Soil Test Interpretation and fertilizer recommendations, and it is available online. It has this reference number for it, but if you just type in, soil test interpretations, you'll probably find it even in Google, or I could be happy to send you the link to that publication as well. It's part of our bookstore for that kind of stuff. Now, there are other references and interpretations that may be applicable in some cases, but this is the one that I'm going to focus at least on this evening. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about pH. If there is one test that is the very most important test that you could do for your soil, and that quite honestly you could get away with less web samples and still have a useful result, it's going to be pH. pH is has so much to do with the availability and the uptake and just all of the things related to the chemistry associated with fertilizers and soil, the ability of the microbes that are in the soil to process and utilize the organic materials that are available in soil. pH is really everything. And you can see here that most of our agronomic crops are going to be, we want to see the range somewhere between 6 and 7. And so you'll see that some crops have fairly big chunks or high availability at those locations, and other ones have smaller amounts. And some of them, especially some of your micronutrients, can even be toxic at levels outside of their ideal realms as well. So there's a reason for our goal of trying to keep pH as much as possible between 6 and 7. One of the first ones that we will commonly see a deficiency in when pH gets too low is going to be iron, especially in our broadleaf crops like soybeans. They will show some iron deficiency. Usually the best treatment for that is to properly lime the soil so that, oh, sorry, I'm saying this backwards. Oh, geez, sorry guys. When the pH gets too high, you'll see that they get a lower availability, and so that results in the case of having an iron deficiency. Usually the best thing to do for that is to try to manage and make sure that you don't apply more lime. In a very, very, very high value crops, we sometimes use elemental lime to lower the pH, but agronomic crops in Kansas just don't meet those qualifications for really, really, really high value. I've done the math before for a producer. We're talking, $10,000, $20,000 an acre to add enough sulfur, elemental sulfur, to make a pH change. So ultimately not something that we would commonly do, but you can see that when pH gets low, things like phosphorus can become tied up or unavailable. So those are situations that we have to keep in mind and remember so that we understand why pH is the #1 thing. I recently had a producer submit samples to the lab themselves, and they wanted to see some of the micronutrients and other tests that other labs other than K-State Research and Extension almost always will include. And since they sent to the lab themselves, they forgot to mention, I guess, they also wanted a pH test. And we were seeing some really wacky results. And so I realized that they didn't have a pH test, and I asked for permission to, to ask the lab to go ahead and rerun just pH. And yep, it was pH was the results of those wacky results were because there was pH problems in one field and not the other. So ultimately pH is #1 and something that we really need to keep our eye on in order to effectively manage soil fertility and grow healthy crops. All right. I don't want to go into huge amounts of detail on understanding lime recommendations, primarily because any lab is going to help you through the process of step 1 and step 2. And those are really, any lab is going to be basically the same on step 1 and step 2. They might use different target pHs depending on where they are. In my career, I have seen us go from a target pH for all crops of 6.8 down to most crops, including soybeans. We use a target pH of 6.0 now, and that is due to research. Lots of research has been done at the university and other places that the cost benefit of adding more lime to use a higher target pH is not beneficial. So that's why we now use that target pH of 6.0. But alfalfa and clover still does use a target pH of 6.8. So, but if you are somebody who would like to see a target pH of 6.8 and you get a soil test from K-State or at a lab that doesn't use that target pH, you can go to our publication, which this is just a screen capture of our publication, and you can make it work. So step 1 is to decide whether you need to, whether your soil pH is low. And now with K-State Research and Extension recommendations, all crops will be, when the pH is below 5.8, there will be a lime recommendation. For alfalfa and clover, if the pH is below 6.4, there will be a lime recommendation. So that's kind of how that is done, and every lab will do that for you. If you want to kind of break the rules and do some things, I'll help you kind of show you how you could do that later. Step 2, use the buffer pH to determine how much lime is required. So you use the soil pH to tell you if you need to add lime, and the buffer pH tells you how much. And that's what's really important. The soil pH doesn't matter once you've decided that you need to add lime. Buffer pH is everything, because buffer pH talks about how reactive that soil is to the application of lime. Some soils can be changed with a very minimal amount of lime applied, and other soils it takes a lot of lime in order to change the pH. So the buffer pH is the answer and what you would want to use once you've made the decision about whether you're going to lime or not. And you'll notice that the higher the buffer pH, the lower the amount of lime that's recommended. The lower the buffer pH, the more lime is recommended. So step 3 and 4 are things that a lot of times get left out of calculating lime recommendations, especially by producers that maybe are less informed or less knowledgeable about how these recommendations are generated. So historically, we used to use things like moldboard plows to prepare the soil, and we would use that moldboard plow to incorporate the lime that we might apply 6.67 inches deep, or almost 7 inches deep. And that was very common for a long, long time. And a lot of the historical data is based on that, and making sure that the soil test results mean something. But we very rarely do that anymore. We don't effectively incorporate lime 6.67 inches deep. Even if you run a disc and run it, 6 or 7 inches deep, you're probably only really incorporating that lime about 4 inches deep, or about half the depth that you are running that tillage implement. And then a lot of times we're using no-till practices as well. So you want to compare the depth of incorporation to that old-fashioned 6.67 inch depth. And that's really important to keep in mind when looking at your lime recommendations. And then the last step is to calculate the amount of ag lime or from some other source. Okay, I'm gonna have to roll. I get to talking. But essentially, if you're going to determine if your pH is low, if your soil pH is 5.7 and you're going to grow corn, yep, your pH is low. You're going to set a target pH of 6.0. And this line right here says that you need 4,125 pounds of ECC per acre. And if you're doing no-till, we assume an incorporation from freeze thaw and natural processes of around 2 inches. So that's about a 30% incorporation. So you take that times 30%. If you use 60% ECC ag lime, you're going to come up with needing about 1 ton of ag lime per acre. And so that's kind of the process of doing that. Our dealers that supply lime and those ag businesses can easily help you with that, or I'd be happy to help you with that as well. So here's another example. Again, your soil test company or the lab that you used is going to give you a lime ECC, but it's probably going to be based on that 6.67 incorporation. So you need to adjust that. If you're going to disc deeply, you can assume approximately 4-inch incorporation. That's about 60%. You can do the math here, and it ends up being 1.2 tons of ag lime per acre. But if this is somebody who is seeding new brome grass and their soil pH is 5.4, I'm going to recommend brome grass as a perennial crop. I'm going to recommend that they go ahead and put on 2 tons of ag lime and incorporate it as deeply as they can. And they're not going to cause any problems from too high of pH in this case. But the problems associated with that low of a soil pH would warrant going ahead and putting on some lime and be close enough. I guess the nice way to say it is that with lime application, it's kind of like dancing close enough is good enough. So anyway, all right. So another thing that I really like to use, and I doubt that many people know that it's out there, is that the agronomy lab at K-State has an Excel-based program. It was developed originally in 2003. So I have been using it most of my career to do some soil test recommendations. It wasn't until fairly recently that the soil testing lab started to auto-generate those soil test recommendations. So earlier in my career, I even got to be more involved in the recommendation process associated with soil testing. And to be honest, since it's something that I'm passionate about, if there's a soil test that comes in with some weird recommendations, I'm going to pull out this Excel program and run it myself and kind of maybe break the system sometimes to see how I might adjust that or make some comments to the producer about their soil test, because I want the producers and the farmers and the business people to be successful here in Pottawatomie County. So here's a kind of a screenshot of that Excel document. Here I highlighted or circled the tillage and the lime incorporation depth, and you can see that this soil was 5.7 with a buffer pH of 6.4. And this was the lime recommendation, 3,250, with that moldboard plow type of incorporation. But if they instead were no-till and only incorporated 2 inches deep, that lime recommendation changes to 1,000. So I guess what I'm trying to say is don't be afraid of the, I guess, the math associated with this. If you get this Excel spreadsheet and you want to put in those pieces of information, it will dump back out for you a lime recommendation, and then all you have to do is consider the ECC of the lime product that you're using. So it's either ag lime or pelletized lime or something like that. It's going to be the choices that you would have at that point. So a lot of our properties that kind of end up with some lower pHs are not needing as much lime, sometimes based on the goal of a target pH of 6.0. And that's probably one of the challenges that I face in having the experience that I have. I'm going to back up one slide right here. There's a Pottawatomie County is, of course, in the Northeast region. If you want to break the system and get a higher target pH for your crops, especially those like soybeans, one way that you can do it is to use this Excel document, or ask me to, and change this to a Southeast area county. For example, I worked in Anderson County for a long time. If you change it to Anderson County, it will call it Southeast, and then it will use a target pH of 6.8. So that is kind of a secret on how you can break the system to make it give you what the recommendation would have been, when we had a target pH of 6.8. So that's, I guess, my secret to you, those of you that are watching or will watch later, on how you can change that so you don't have to do the math. The software will do it for you. Okay. Fertilizer recommendation philosophy. This is where a lot of us feel less confident. And we can't, we shouldn't blame ourselves for that lack of confidence, because we get some very, very different results sometimes. We get very different recommendations based on which lab that we used, which supplier that we're using, which philosophy that they incorporate into their recommendations, whether you talk to your neighbors and use that in your recommendations. And I'm here to say that none of the options and none of the recommendations that are given by reputable accredited labs are wrong. They're not. They're all correct, but they have a different philosophy. And that philosophy may be the same as yours, or it may be different than yours. And so I want to empower those of us that are producers, or people that are producers, with the knowledge to know what recommendations would match their yield goals, would match their philosophy goals, and basically make those decisions in an educated manner. Again, none of them are wrong. They're all reputable and responsible decisions, but some of them could make some differences, especially in terms of the bottom line in the pocketbook. And sometimes that is the important thing for a producer. And if they're wanting to worry about their pocketbook as their almost number one factor, then the old-fashioned and continuing to be our go-to philosophy for fertilizer recommendations is going to be called sufficiency. And this is based on 100 years or more of research that has been done, trying to get crops to grow and respond, so a responsive range for fertilizer. A little piece of information about that: if you follow a sufficiency recommendation, and have always followed a sufficiency recommendation from K-State Research and Extension, going back to the 60s, 50s, whatever, you're going to naturally cause your phosphorus levels, for example, to be about 12 to 13. Okay, so below that ideal range that we're looking for, right? But what that means is that it is responsive to fertilizer. In other words, you're going to need to apply fertilizer every year, and you're going to kind of maintain that 12, 13, 14 range, where you need to apply a little bit of fertilizer every year, but not a whole large amount either. And that's kind of the natural idea behind sufficiency. It works the same with potassium, but in this part of the state, we rarely have major potassium deficiency problems. So phosphorus is the one I'm going to kind of talk about the most. Build maintenance is a newer, not new, but newer K-State recommendation. And the idea behind that is more closely matches a lot of the other ag businesses and labs, and that is to try to get the levels of the nutrients that are not lost over time as easily, like phosphorus and potassium, into what they call a maintenance range. And the research that we have done has found that for phosphorus, that's between 20 and 30 parts per million. And if you follow a sufficiency recommendation and your soil test is below 20, you're going to have a fertilizer recommendation. If you follow a build maintenance recommendation and your soil test is between 20 and 30, they're going to maintain that, or encourage you to maintain that, by basically matching the crop removal. So the removal of the crop each year, they're going to require you to, or suggest that you apply a minimal amount of fertilizer that should keep you in that range. Now, if your soil test happens to be above 30, they're going to say you don't need any more fertilizer, or at the very most, you might need a little bit of starter fertilizer. And if it gets above about 50 parts per million, there starts to be some concerns as far as environmental risk. It's really high at about 100 parts per million. That's not going to occur in a field that hasn't received some manure application or something like that, or just somebody who has been pouring lots and lots of fertilizer without soil testing. But essentially, anything above 50, they're not going to generally recommend a lot of starter or manure application, and absolutely none when we get to that about 100. And then other philosophies that other labs might use, or agribusinesses might use, would be to build up into a critical range. And maybe they think that the critical range needs to be a little higher. They don't want it at 20, they want it more at that upper limit of 30. Maybe they try to build and maintain between 30 and 50. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, especially because phosphorus is not a nutrient that we're going to lose. If you have a disaster of a crop this year because of a drought, that fertilizer isn't going anywhere. If the crop doesn't take it up, for the most part, it stays put and is available the next year. There are some exceptions to that, but as a general rule, you don't lose phosphorus fertilizer applied to a field as long as you're below that 50 parts per million for sure, unless there's a lot of slope or some other weird stuff. So, this is a reasonable option where you just want to replace crop removal every year, for a long period of time. There's other philosophies. And again, I've never seen something that I would honestly say is wrong. I would say that the philosophies influence the economics often associated with things, and they sometimes can influence yield. A sufficiency recommendation you'll see here should provide enough fertility to always be able to achieve 95% of the yield goal. And if conditions are perfect, so we get rain when we need it and all those kinds of things, 100% or more is not going to stop it, I guess is what I mean to say. But long-term, 95% of yield goal is kind of the goal of a sufficiency recommendation. A build maintain, you're really trying to get that last little bit, but that last little bit is less cost effective. And so that's really why, and something to consider. If you're following one of the two K-State recommendations, I would encourage you to consider sufficiency at least, of course, because that's going to be your conservative answer. Build maintain is a wonderful set of recommendations. The reason I wouldn't do it in some cases is in rented ground where you do not have a long-term contract. If you've spent money to apply phosphorus and then you lose that property, then you no longer have the opportunity to take advantage of the fact that you raise that phosphorus level in that maintain or build recommendation. And so If you want to follow a build maintenance, I would encourage you to either own it or have a long-term arrangement where you are working with the landowner and you know that you're not going to have that taken away from you in a short period of time. Fertilizer recommendations are going to be on any soil test report. K-States look like this. So they have the basic results here, and then below it, they have these recommendations for the soil test. There's a nitrogen recommendation, a phosphorus recommendation. There's this lime recommendation over here. These are kind of hard to me to understand sometimes because they didn't put like lines here, but they're down. So sufficiency recommendation for phosphorus is going to be posted here. Potassium sufficiency recommendation, zinc, and if there's other things recommended, they would go here as well. So those are how the fertilizer recommendations will come out of the K-State lab. This is an example of another lab, and I'm not going to tell you who, and it doesn't really matter. But again, they had the same soil test results. In other words, there's no belief that I would have that the results that they sent to this lab would be any different than the results that would come out of K-State's lab if they ran all the exact same tests. But you can see that the fertilizer recommendations are different, okay? The sufficiency K-State for this exact same thing is going to be that you need 40 and 45 pounds of phosphate or phosphorus P2O5, and they're recommending 70 and 75. They wouldn't recommend any potassium in any of these tests because the potassium levels are over that 130, which is the one critical number. But for this test, they recommended 25 pounds of potash. For sulfur and zinc, again, K-State recommendations are going to be zeros, and they do have recommendations here. Again, not wrong, just different philosophy. And so understanding that is important on a purely, I'm going to try to cost or cash flow my operation, especially in those kind of concerning times. The sufficiency recommendations are going to best able you to accomplish that goal. Here is the build recommendations on a pretty aggressive build. 4 years is not very long to go from 9 parts per million up to 20, but that's what this recommendation would accomplish. And they are to put 80 or 85 pounds of phosphorus on. Again, no potassium because these levels are well above the 130 critical level that K-State Research and Extension uses. And again, no zinc or sulfur, primarily no zinc because they're growing soybeans and these zinc levels are above 1.0. That's kind of the critical level. And very rarely will K-State generate a sulfur recommendation. Sometimes you can force it to, but it really doesn't mean much unless you do that deep 24-inch sample. So that's, now do you need sulfur? Yeah, probably. Our Clean Air Acts have caused us to need sulfur. But as far as a soil test being able to tell you that, the only way that you can do that, and it is very accurate if you do, is the 24-inch dip sample. Otherwise, you're kind of just trying to guess because it moves like nitrogen. Sulfur will move and be lost just like nitrogen is, essentially, or very similarly. And so, you know, you do need to apply it annually, and very likely with our cleaner air, that sulfur is needed, but I wouldn't necessarily base that on a 6-inch soil sample result. So nitrogen recommendations, again, are in this publication. If you're not an Excel person, you just want to see a chart. This is an example. They base it off of soil organic matter and then your yield goal. And there's even a formula to do it if that you want. But if you know that your soil organic matter is 2 and you want to grow 100 bushel corn, you can see 90 is going to be your recommendation. These other crop adjustments, they give 40 40 pounds for a previous crop of soybeans. And this formula automatically uses the 2O, but if your soil test organic matter is a lot higher than that, which does exist in a lot of cases, you're going to get a lower soil test recommendation, or lower soil test nitrogen recommendation. Phosphorus and potassium sufficiency, again, similar charts, different formulas, all the same kinds of pieces of information. I guess the thing to see here clearly again is that critical value for phosphorus is going to be 20 for a K-State recommendation, and it's going to be 130 for potassium. It's pretty rare that we're going to have soils in Pottawatomie County or anywhere in this general vicinity that get closer to that 130. But if they do, I'm pretty sure they need some potassium, and we'll talk about that in particular next week when we talk about forages. That's where it really comes into play most of the time. So here's another example. I just put these up here so you could see them as I'm getting down to only 9 minutes. We're gonna have to hustle. And I may go over again, like I said. But you can put different crops in here. You can name them whatever you want. You can put in your soil depth, your intended crops, your previous crops. If you want more recommendations for second crops or third crops, like you're trying to decide, am I going to grow corn, or am I going to grow milo, or am I going to, you know, if you're trying to figure out what you're going to do, you can put all of those things in there. They use tons per acre for your alfalfas or your silages. And you can put your pHs in and your phosphorus and potassium levels. And the next thing that it will spit out are recommendations. And so this is, like I said, for the most of my career, this was my job to essentially take the analytical data from the soil testing lab at K-State and put it into the sheet and then generate this. And if I have comments about things, I can still do that, and I can make those comments here, or onto the newer forms, I can add those as well. And I often will do that in particular for weird pH situations, and then also weird nitrogen recommendations. I've had some nitrogen recommendations for corn be as low as like 45 pounds per acre from the soil testing lab, because the organic matter was 4% and their previous crop was soybeans. And I don't think any of you that grow any corn are going to feel confident in me telling you that 45 pounds is enough. It's probably not. And so I will often make a little comment, you know, probably at least 60. I wouldn't really question you if you went more than that, for example, and I will make comments about things like that that are a little bit maybe wonky with the automated results that we might get from a soil test lab results and recommendations at K-State. So again, for phosphorus and potassium, which are nutrients that we apply, macronutrients that we apply that don't go anywhere. In other words, they are not going to move on you or move very little. We support a build maintenance recommendation for all of our field crops. So that's going to be corn, soybeans, wheat, grain sorghum, milo, forage sorghums, you know, all of those kinds of things that are your field crops. They are not going to do it for grasses or any perennial crop like alfalfa, just so you know. So this is for corn, what those recommendations are based on a 4, 6, or 8 year build. They keep in mind these crop removal numbers. So each crop, based on their yield, for example, corn, for every bushel of corn that's produced on average, researchers showed us that it removes 0.33 pounds of P2O5. And for every bushel of potassium, we get 0.26. So you can do the math. You know, this year, maybe you had 200 bushel corn. and it removed more potassium and phosphorus than your previous crops because your yield was lower. So that's kind of a way that we can almost make a checkbook of our fertilizer or our soil fertility and keep track of what we would expect to happen. Likewise, if you have a bad drought year and you only grow 50 bushel corn, it's removing less phosphorus and less potassium. Okay. And I just kind of wanted to show you where you put that information on the Excel form if you really want to play with this and learn a little bit about it. By the way, even if you did your soil tests elsewhere at a lab other than K-State, but if you would like some assistance or if you would just like me to do it, I would be happy to put those results into like this Excel form and give you recommendations based on sufficiency or build maintain off of the K-State recommendations. I do believe very strongly that knowledge is power. And so, you know, that way you as a producer know what you're doing. You may choose to still follow a more aggressive recommendation, but at least you know what the recommendations would have been following kind of the K-State sufficiency recommendations, for example. But again, build maintain, I changed it to 8 years and left these things here. And you can see that I put the sufficiency recommendations in the white numbers here, but the build maintain numbers are dramatically higher. You know, here we're recommending 70 pounds of P2O5 because that level is in that range, you know, between 130 and say 150 or 170. So we're needing to replace the crop removal. And again, silage is going to be a heavy remover of all of our nutrients because you're removing the entire plant from the location. Wheat, you can see here that in all cases, they're going to be higher numbers if you try to do a build maintain, with the exception of the previous crop. For alfalfa, they're going to give you that, but they're not going to give you much of anything else in terms of that. So if you put in brome, for example, it's not going to give you a recommendation. And that's why this one's 0, because they're considering alfalfa a forage crop. All right, so common agricultural fertilizers. Those of you who have been producers for a long time or in ag businesses should recognize a lot of these. These are examples of nitrogen sources, phosphorus sources, and potassium sources that are available. I don't think that any of our local agri-service businesses have any liquid 721.7. At least I haven't found them too, but all the rest of these are available at different ones and different businesses in Pottawatomie County. By the way, I have a little bit of a sweet spot for 721.7 because my master's degree research involved using that product and looking at placement of fertilizer. But again, not something that I have found here locally, and it is kind of an expensive product for the most part. It is important when you're choosing which fertilizer sources to use to consider the price per unit. So for example, more times than not, although now might be the exception to that rule, ammonium nitrate is going to be cheaper per ton than urea, but on a cost price per unit, it will often be more expensive than urea. So those are that's an example of something to keep in mind. Environmental considerations are also important. Conditions I wrote there, but that's fine too. For example, urea has a tendency to, half of it at least anyway, to volatilize. So if it is wet and hot, using urea may not be very effective, especially if you're not going to incorporate it. Maybe you do need to go to ammonium nitrate. because you're not going to lose the nitrogen from volatilization. And that's kind of a common example of environmental conditions. And then, and also anhydrous ammonia is always going to be your least expensive source of nitrogen. But if the soil's super dry and you can't seal the knives opening, not going to be a choice that you're going to want to choose, because you're going to lose a lot of your nitrogen source. And then application costs. You know, if you choose to apply the gas and then you choose to apply a liquid and then you choose a dry product, you have to include all of those application costs. So you really do need to think about all of those things when you're making those decisions. Sulfur and zinc sources, I've listed those as well here. Again, consider all of those things when you are making choices for your operation. All right. So understanding fertilizer rates, and I'm out of time, but I'm going to keep going. And if you need to go, I understand, but I won't take too terribly much longer. I'm probably roughly 90% through. But in a fertilizer rate, they always, or a fertilizer, they will always sell it based off of these three things. They will give you the percent N, the percent P2O5, always as P2O5, and percent K2O. And any fertilizer has it. Even if you go to the, I don't know, to the hardware store or the Walmart and pick up some Miracle-Gro, you will find on that box somewhere what the N, P2O5, K2O fertilizer blend is for that particular source of fertilizer. And it always means a percentage. So if you have 100 pounds of fertilizer, that's 18 pounds of nitrogen, 46 pounds of P2O5, and 0 pounds of K2O. Because we're running a little long, I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but the other thing that I kind of hate that is misunderstood a lot is that, of course, this doesn't add up to 100%. And so some people will say, well, that's other stuff is junk. Well, no, it's not filler. It's not junk in many cases. In many cases, it's related to the elements that are in the fertilizer source. You know, this is called DAP. It's diammonium phosphate. It is different than N, P2O5, K2O. So it's basically based on elements, weight, and all of those things, and a little bit of purity. But for the most part, our agronomic fertilizers are readily available, and you're not applying a lot of filler with these products. Fertilizer rates, again, I just want to kind of show you how this works. So if you want to apply 30 pounds of phosphorus or P2O5 per acre, the way that you would do that is you set up a formula where 30 pounds of P2O5 is equal to the amount of fertilizer that you need to apply, in this case, the DAP fertilizer, and you're using 46% as in decimal form. You do the math and you come up with 65 pounds of fertilizer. And then you may ask yourself, well, how much nitrogen did I apply when I applied the 65 pounds of fertilizer? Well, you can do that here too. So 65 times 18% in decimal form, you applied a little under 12 pounds of nitrogen. And that is the basis of all fertilizer stuff. If you can do this basic math, or at least have the software or whatever help you do that, you understand math, or you understand fertilizers perfectly. And my daughter, who asked me whether we use any of this math in the real world, you can answer it by saying yes. You know, this formula is something that we can apply in the real world, and it helps us every year and every day. So here's an example of a recommendation of 85 pounds of nitrogen, 35 pounds of P2O5, and no potassium, and then 2 pounds of zinc. And I wanted to kind of quickly show you how that works out as far as calculating the blend or the fertilizer that you would be using. Now, I will say first off that this is not a great blend. because I'm using pretty much every fertilizer source out there on purpose, just to kind of show you how to math it. But if you follow these 4 steps, or 5 steps, I guess, you can always calculate the blend or whatever that you would like to use. So the first step is to determine how much N, P2O5, and K2O you want to apply. So here it is there. And are you going to use some starter fertilizer? Or did you already apply manure? Any of those types of questions, I guess, go into here. If you've decided that you want to make sure that you apply 20 pounds of P as a starter, and you're going to use this product, it has this density, you can do the math. So you come up with a little under 59 pounds of the fertilizer product. You use the density to make it, well, not yet. Then you figure out how much nitrogen that is, a little under 6 pounds of nitrogen. Use the density to determine how many gallons per acre that is. And then do the math to figure out what you have left over. So we started with 85, 35, 0. Now we have 79, 15, 0. So then you move on to phosphorus. And the reason we go to phosphorus is step 3 is that phosphorus there's really very limited and no agronomically available fertilizers that don't include nitrogen as well. So we want to start with the phosphorus because we need to meet that need first. And you're always going to need to add more nitrogen to accomplish that. So we're going to use DAP, figure that out by 15, which was the amount we had left over, divided by that to figure out how many pounds of DAP fertilizer you would need, figure out how much nitrogen's included in that, and then do the math that's left. So we now know that I need a little over 73 pounds of nitrogen in any other way. Now, if there was a recommendation for potassium, this is where you would do it in step 4, but there isn't any. So we know we're going to use anhydrous ammonia. We use the math and we come up with about 90 pounds of anhydrous per acre. So really, if you can do these 5 steps and walk it through, you can come up with any fertilizer recommendation and blend that you want. If you know that you're using a liquid fertilizer and you want to figure out what liquid fertilizer for nitrogen would go along with it, great, it can be done. You know, if you're using a dry fertilizer and you want to figure out what dry fertilizer blend you would need, or if you need potassium that's in dry formulation, it can be done. So if you know what you want to include in your fertilizer recommendations, you can do the math to figure out what your recommendation should be. And again, if it's something that you are a little intimidated with, I am happy to walk through a few with you and even help you forever. But your fertilizer dealers are going to be willing to do this for you too. They're not, especially if you've already made your philosophy decisions, either you're following maybe their recommendations, or even if you're not, they're not going to mislead you on this. This part is pretty simple math, and it can be done, and it's a great idea to have an idea of what you're doing in that aspect as well. So in this case, I'm applying 90 pounds of anhydrous. I'm using 5 gallons of 1034O as a starter, and I'm applying 33 pounds of DAP. I didn't show you the calculations for zinc, but I would use zinc sulfate and apply 6 pounds of it to meet this recommendation. And so we're down to the end, guys. So the additional resources that are easily available are that there's a fertilizer calculation spreadsheet that was originally done by Mr. Scott Gordon, who is the former Montgomery County Extension agent. In my career, he was the agent for several years, and then he has since left Extension and is farming full time. But I've been in communication with him recently, and he's willing to share with you, those of you that might be interested in it. It calculates your dry and liquid fertilizer blends based on prices and everything. So it will give you a least cost option for a dry or a liquid fertilizer blend. The trick to it, unfortunately, because it's from Southeast Kansas, they have essentially no map available. So can't use map for this spreadsheet. Ammonium nitrate isn't available on it either because, Timothy McVeigh, isn't that the right name, did bomb Oklahoma City with ammonium nitrate. So a lot of suppliers cannot get that product. It doesn't have any liquid 21.7, but again, that's not really available here, and it doesn't deal with some of the sulfur or zinc or those kinds of things. And another thing that I do have available is a fertility management plan spreadsheet, and I'll talk a lot more about that on the presentation that I do, the last one, because this is something that I've created that will help you kind of follow along and predict what your soil test levels will be based on the fertilizer applications you've made and the yields of the crops and the crops that you grew and all those kinds of things. It's not an exact science. Fertility really isn't, but it can really help you keep track of things and you can see trends over time. By the way, I did not say this earlier, but soil testing needs to be done about every 3 to 5 years. You don't need to do it every year. There's no real reason to do it every year. So every 3 to 5 years, you can use those recommendations. And if you want to grow, corn, soybeans, corn, you can always put that in as your second choice of crop. And those would be automatically generated so that you can follow that recommendation long term. Or again, you can speak with me and I'd be happy to give you the recommendations for the crop that in the year after you grew and did your soil test. So ultimately that's available at any time as well. I think I may have put my spreadsheet on our website, which is potawatomi.ksu.edu. But again, if you email me or call me at the office, I'm happy to provide that as well. And so this is the end, guys. I didn't do too bad, only about 13 minutes over, which is pretty good for me. But fertilizer basics we've covered tonight. And we talked about all the important things that relate to that. You may have questions, and if you do, don't hesitate to ask me. I'm very happy to talk about this subject, help you work through some situations. I've sat down with quite a few producers over the years and went over their soil test recommendations and kind of discussed with them how they feel about the philosophies that are used and all of those kinds of things. So it is a really great place to start. Next Thursday, I'm going to focus on fertilizing forages. So obviously here in Pot County, we grow a lot of forages as well. So we're going to talk about all the different forage species, from those that are grown in fields to even things like prairie hay meadows and crabgrass and some of the more unique options available for forage species. We're going to talk about how the harvest method impacts fertilizer recommendations, how forage quality is impacted by the fertilizer and the soil fertility that you implement, and then weed concerns that are related to low soil fertility or even high soil fertility in some cases. So that'll be next week, and then the last week will be more of an advanced nutrient management. If you are going to join me for that one, if you wouldn't mind either submitting, if you haven't already, the questions or priorities that you would like me to focus on, I would really appreciate that. You can call me, you can email me, you can put it on the form that's signed up for the presentation. But ultimately, in advanced nutrient management, I could probably go on for 2 or 3 semesters if we needed to, but none of us want to do that. This is not what Extension's goal is going to be. So I want to really tailor this to what things that you might want more information about. And these were some of my ideas, but again, there may be something specific that you would like to know more about, and I would be very happy to address that on the last meeting. So before we go tonight, does anybody have any burning questions or something that they want me to scroll back to before we go this evening?
No.
Nope. Okay. Well, good. I hope I didn't wear you out completely, but it really is an important aspect that a lot of producers just don't emphasize. And it's because there's definitely qualified people to help them as far as the dealers and those kinds of people. But I do think that, again, knowledge is power, and understanding it can avoid a lot of bad situations. You know, I know that sometimes when we get a funky result where we apply a fertilizer and don't get an increased yield, we start to distrust the system. And I know that there are cases where that has happened. And if you do that for too long, you can end up with, you know, really severe issues. So, you know, really understanding and learning more about soil fertility is important if you are making decisions in regards to fertilizer and nutrient management. All right. Well,
I got a question. Can flooded water take a lot of nutrients out of the ground?
What now? What water?
Flooded, like our ground, we had 120 acres. It sat underneath the water when the lake came up last year for a year.
Yeah.
A lot of nutrients out.
Yeah, and you know, all of your a lot of your nutrients are going to be lost when it is saturated like that for a long period of time. Your nitrogen, obviously, your chlorides and sulfur are easily going to be lost. Even the potassium and the phosphorus can be pretty severely impacted just because you've essentially made an anaerobic environment, and the microbes that, you know, break down the materials and things have a hard time surviving in that kind of environment. I don't know if any of you have ever like taken the I don't know, cleaned out a pond, for example, after years, and then tried to apply that to your garden, for example, or even your farm field. If you put too much of that, and it may be very, very high fertility still, but if you put too much of that material on a place where you're trying to grow crops, there's no microorganisms in that soil anymore that can help transition between the available different forms. So yes, unfortunately, if it's been underwater for a year, I would encourage someone to soil test that, even if it had been a short period of time between when the last time that you soil tested. Number one, soil testing is cheap. In Pot County, we get free ones up to 10 annually. And even if you pay the full price at K-State for the basic test, we're talking $7. So that's cheap. And it's cheap insurance. Our soil tests do an excellent job. They really do. And all lab soil tests do an excellent job of predicting response in the field. The calibration and correlation of soil testing is a very fine science. And if those major nutrients, if the soil test says that you need them, then you will get a response to that. For sure in some cases. You know, I think back to my master's degree, and I ended up having to move a location at the last minute. So we soil tested it on the same day as we planted. which is never a great plan, right? But it happened. And I, again, was using 721.7, but was working primarily with potassium and potassium placement. But that was only 7%. 21% was phosphorus. Well, when I moved my location, I didn't know that I ended up on a low phosphorus site. And so I got a enormous response to phosphorus. So a lot of people over the years have said, my dad, I had to argue with him. You know, he would say, you can't fertilize soybeans, you know, the landowner won't let you, whatever. I'm here to tell you that if you have low phosphorus levels in particular, it will pay for itself. You know, they will make more money if you have a low level and go ahead and fertilize it. Now, you can get around that by over applying phosphorus in your corn years, for example, because again, it carries over. But in a low phosphorus situation, even beans, potassium, they'll all respond when the levels are low. So yeah, I would say the major ones for sure. It'd be interesting to see what the phosphorus or potassium levels did being underwater. Phosphorus probably was lost because it can be very soluble in cases. So I would put some money on that. Anybody have anything else? All right. Well, thanks for joining me this evening, and I will kind of edit the video to make it less cumbersome and make that available for those that were not able to join us this evening that might want to get the information. But go ahead and spread the word that we're doing these things, and I'd love to have more people participate and be part of them as well. And then at the end of all three is when I'm going to send kind of an evaluation type of situation. So even if this is the only one that you attend, you're still going to get an evaluation, and you can just note that you only attended tonight, for example, or so forth. And the idea behind that is I don't want to inundate you with that every time, but your participation in the evaluation part helps me justify myself and the work that we're doing.